What happens when Hollywood's most famously private actor gets pushed too far by a late-night host who refuses to back down? The answer involves raised voices, uncomfortable silences, and one of the most shocking walkouts in television history. Before we dive into this incredible story, make sure to hit that subscribe button and let me know in the comments what you think really triggered Harrison Ford's explosive reaction. The studio audience at Jimmy Kimmel Live was buzzing with anticipation. Harrison Ford, the legendary star of Indiana Jones and Star Wars, had agreed to appear on the show to promote his latest project. What should have been a routine promotional interview was about to become television gold for all the wrong reasons. As Ford walked onto the stage, his usual reserved demeanor was immediately apparent. The 70-something actor moved with the same deliberate pace that had characterized his performances for decades, offering a brief wave to the cheering crowd before settling into the guest chair. Jimmy Kimmel, known for his playful interviewing style, greeted Ford with his trademark enthusiasm. "Harrison Ford, everybody," Kimmel announced to thunderous applause. "Thank you so much for being here. I have to say, you look fantastic." Ford nodded politely, his hands clasped in his lap. "Thank you for having me, Jimmy." The interview began innocuously enough. Kimmel asked about Ford's current project, and the actor provided measured, professional responses. But anyone familiar with Ford's interview history knew that beneath his calm exterior lay a man who valued his privacy fiercely and had little patience for what he considered frivolous questions. "So, Harrison," Kimmel continued, leaning forward in his chair, "I have to ask about something that happened behind the scenes today. My producers tell me you had some very specific requests about what we could and couldn't discuss tonight." Ford's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "I think it's reasonable for guests to have some boundaries about their personal lives." Of course," Kimmel replied, but his tone suggested he wasn't quite ready to drop the subject. "But some of these requests were pretty unusual. I mean, we can't mention your age, your family, your previous marriages, your flying, your carpentry work, or your environmental activism. That doesn't leave us with much to talk about besides movies." The audience chuckled, but Ford's expression remained stoic. "I'm here to talk about my work, Jimmy. That's what this is supposed to be about." Kimmel raised his hands in mock surrender. Fair enough, but you have to admit, it's a little ironic that Han Solo doesn't want to talk about flying." The comment drew laughter from the audience, but Ford's response was ice cold. "I don't see anything ironic about maintaining professional boundaries." The tension in the studio was becoming palpable. Kimmel, perhaps sensing he was walking into dangerous territory but unable to resist pushing further, decided to change tactics. "Okay, let's talk about your reputation then," Kimmel said, his smile never wavering. "You're known as one of Hollywood's most serious actors, but also one of the most difficult to interview. Some people say you hate talking to the press. Is that fair?" Ford shifted in his chair, and for the first time since sitting down, he looked directly at Kimmel with an intensity that made the host visibly uncomfortable. "I don't hate talking to the press, Jimmy. I hate talking to people who don't listen to what I'm saying and keep pushing when I've made my position clear." The studio fell silent except for the uncomfortable rustling of the audience. Kimmel's smile faltered for just a moment before he recovered his composure. "Well, I'm listening," Kimmel said, but his tone had taken on a slightly defensive edge. "I'm just trying to give our audience a chance to get to know the real Harrison Ford." "The real Harrison Ford is an actor," Ford replied, his voice remaining level but carrying an unmistakable warning. "That's all the audience needs to know." Kimmel glanced at his notes, clearly trying to navigate back to safer ground, but something in his expression suggested he wasn't quite ready to concede defeat. The late-night host had built his career on his ability to get celebrities to open up, to reveal the human side behind the Hollywood facade. Harrison Ford was proving to be his most challenging opponent yet. "You know what, Harrison," Kimmel said, setting his note cards aside. I think our audience deserves better than just talking points and promotional material. They want to connect with you as a person. Ford's eyes narrowed. What they deserve is respect for boundaries and professionalism. Something that seems to be in short supply here tonight. The comment landed like a bomb in the studio. Several audience members gasped audibly, and Kimmel's face flushed red. The genial host, who usually maintained his composure even during the most awkward celebrity encounters, suddenly found himself on the defensive. "Excuse me," Kimmel said, his voice rising slightly, "but I think I've been nothing but professional. I'm just doing my job here." "Your job," Ford replied, his voice still dangerously calm, "is supposed to be hosting a television show, not conducting an interrogation." The exchange was escalating rapidly, and everyone in the studio could feel it. The camera operators continued, filming, knowing they were capturing something unprecedented. Harrison Ford, the man who had spent decades avoiding controversy and maintaining his privacy, was about to reach his breaking point on live television. Kimmel, perhaps realizing he had pushed too far but unable to back down without losing face, made one final attempt to regain control of the interview. "Look, Harrison, I think you're overreacting here. We're just having a conversation." Ford's response would prove to be the moment that changed everything. He leaned forward in his chair, his famous intensity now focused entirely on the man sitting across from him, and spoke with the kind of quiet authority that had made him one of cinema's most compelling leading men. "No, Jimmy," Ford said, his words cutting through the studio like a blade. "You're having a conversation. I'm being subjected to exactly the kind of harassment I came here hoping to avoid." The word harassment hung in the air like a thunderclap. Jimmy Kimmel's face went through a series of expressions, from shock to indignation to something approaching panic. The studio audience, which had been murmuring uncomfortably throughout the escalating exchange, fell completely silent. Even the band members seemed frozen in their seats, unsure whether they were witnessing television history or a career-ending disaster. Kimmel cleared his throat, attempting to regain his composure, but his voice betrayed his growing frustration. "Harassment? Harrison, that's a pretty strong word for what's been a pretty standard interview." Ford's response was immediate and unflinching. "Standard for who, Jimmy? Because in my experience, professional interviews don't involve ignoring a guest's clearly stated boundaries and then arguing with them when they object." The camera caught every nuance of the exchange, from Kimmel's nervous fidgeting with his tie to Ford's rigid posture in the guest chair. The actor's hands remained clasped in his lap, but his knuckles had gone white with tension. "Look," Kimmel said, forcing a laugh that sounded hollow in the charged atmosphere, "I think we're getting a little too serious here. This is supposed to be fun." "Entertainment. Entertainment," Ford repeated, his voice dripping with disdain. "Is that what you call badgering someone who's trying to do their job?" Kimmel's facade of good humor was cracking visibly. The host, who had made his reputation on his ability to handle any situation with wit and charm, was finding himself outmatched by an actor who had no interest in playing along with the usual celebrity interview game. "I'm not badgering anyone," Kimmel shot back, his voice rising. "I'm asking questions. That's literally what I'm paid to do here." "No," Ford corrected, his tone remaining maddeningly calm while his words cut deep. "You're paid to host a show that entertains people. What you're doing right now is satisfying your own curiosity at my expense." The distinction was razor-sharp, and everyone in the studio felt it. Kimmel's jaw clenched as he processed the accusation. For a moment it seemed like he might apologize and try to steer the conversation back to safer territory. Instead, he made a decision that would prove to be catastrophic. "You know what, Harrison," Kimmel said, his voice taking on an edge of defiance. "Maybe the problem isn't my questions. Maybe the problem is that you've become so isolated from normal human interaction that you've forgotten how conversations work." The studio erupted in shocked gasps. Several audience members could be heard saying "oh no" under their breath. Even the cameramen seemed to recoil behind their equipment. Jimmy Kimmel had just crossed a line that no professional interviewer should ever cross, attacking his guest personally rather than backing down from an uncomfortable situation. Ford's reaction was swift and devastating. He didn't raise his voice or make any sudden movements, but the change in his demeanor was unmistakable. The last vestiges of polite professionalism disappeared from his expression, replaced by something much more dangerous. Isolated, Ford repeated slowly, as if tasting the word. That's an interesting choice of words from someone who makes a living, mocking people for the entertainment of strangers. Kimmel's face went pale. He had expected Ford to either back down or explode in anger. Instead, the actor was dissecting him with surgical precision, and the host was beginning to realize he was completely outgunned. "I don't mock people," Kimmel protested weakly. "I do comedy." "Do you?" Ford replied, and the two words carried more contempt than most people could pack into an entire speech. "Tell me, Jimmy, when you're lying in bed at night, do you ever wonder what it says about a person that their career depends on making other people uncomfortable for laughs?" The question landed like a physical blow. Kimmel's mouth opened and closed silently, his usual quick wit completely abandoning him. The audience was riveted, watching a master class in verbal combat from one of Hollywood's most respected actors. "That's not fair," Kimmel finally managed to say, but his voice lacked conviction. "Fair," Ford mused, as if considering the concept for the first time. "You want to talk about fair? Is it fair to invite someone onto your show under false pretenses? Is it fair to ignore their reasonable requests and then attack them personally when they object? Is it fair to use your position as host to put a guest in a situation where they can't defend themselves without looking like the bad guy?" Each question was delivered with increasing intensity, and Kimmel visibly shrank with each one. The host, who had seemed so confident and in control at the beginning of the interview, now looked like a student being dressed down by a particularly stern teacher. "I didn't attack you," Kimmel said, but even he seemed to know how weak the protest sounded. "You just told me I'm isolated from normal human interaction," Ford replied evenly, "on national television, in front of a live audience. What would you call that?" Kimmel opened his mouth to respond, then closed it again. For perhaps the first time in his career as a talk show host, he was completely speechless. The silence stretched on for what felt like an eternity, broken only by the uncomfortable shuffling of the audience. Ford leaned back in his chair, his point made. "You know, Jimmy, I've been doing interviews for over 40 years. I've dealt with gossip columnists, tabloid reporters, and entertainment journalists of every stripe. But I've never encountered someone who was so determined to prove they were more important than their guest." The observation hit its target with devastating accuracy. Kimmel's entire approach to the interview had been about establishing his dominance, about proving that he couldn't be intimidated by even the most famously difficult Hollywood star. Instead, he had revealed himself to be exactly the kind of self-important media personality that Ford had spent decades avoiding. "That's not what this is about," Kimmel said, but his voice had lost all its earlier confidence. "Isn't it?" Ford asked, and for the first time since the confrontation began, he smiled. It wasn't a pleasant smile. "Then tell me, what is this about? What are you trying to accomplish here?" Kimmel stared at his guest, clearly struggling to formulate an answer that wouldn't make him look worse than he already did. The silence stretched on, becoming more uncomfortable with each passing second. Finally, he attempted one last desperate gambit. "I'm trying to give our audience a good show," Kimmel said, gesturing toward the crowd of increasingly uncomfortable viewers. Ford's smile widened, and somehow that made it even more unsettling. "A good show," he repeated. "Well, Jimmy, I think you're about to get exactly what you wanted." The ominous words sent a chill through the studio. Everyone present could sense that something momentous was about to happen, but no one could have predicted exactly what form it would take. Harrison Ford, The man who had spent his entire career maintaining his dignity and professionalism, even in the most trying circumstances, was about to do something that would shock the entertainment world. The threat in Ford's voice was unmistakable, and Jimmy Kimmel finally seemed to understand that he had pushed one of Hollywood's most respected actors past the point of no return. The host's face had gone from red to pale to a sickly shade of green as the full implications of the situation began to dawn on him. "Harrison," Kimmel said, his voice now pleading rather than confrontational, "maybe we should just take a commercial break and start over." Ford's laugh was cold and humorless. "Start over? You think you can just reset this conversation like it's a video game? That's not how real life works, Jimmy." The audience was completely transfixed, watching what was clearly the most dramatic moment in late-night television history unfold before their eyes. Cell phones were discreetly raised throughout the crowd as people began recording what they sensed would become legendary footage. "Look, I apologize if I overstepped," Kimmel said, finally offering the concession that might have saved the interview if it had come 10 minutes earlier. "I didn't mean to make you uncomfortable." Ford studied the host for a long moment, his expression unreadable. When he finally spoke, his voice was quiet but carried the weight of decades of experience dealing with Hollywood's worst behavior. "You didn't mean to make me uncomfortable," Ford repeated slowly. "Jimmy, that's exactly what you meant to do. That's your entire approach to this job. You think that making people squirm is the same thing as entertaining people." Kimmel shifted uncomfortably in his chair, clearly wanting to deny the accusation, but unable to find the words. The truth of Ford's observation hung in the air between them like an indictment. "The difference between you and a real interviewer," Ford continued, his voice gaining strength, "is that a real interviewer knows the difference between challenging someone and humiliating them. You clearly don't." The words hit their target with surgical precision. Kimmel's reputation was built on his ability to get celebrities to reveal embarrassing stories or react to uncomfortable situations. What he had never considered was how that approach might look to someone who valued dignity and professionalism above entertainment value. "I think you're being unfair," Kimmel said weakly, making one last attempt to defend himself. "Unfair," Ford said, standing up from his chair with deliberate slowness. The simple action sent a shockwave through the studio. Guests didn't stand up during interviews unless they were leaving, and everyone present understood the significance of the moment. "You want to know what's unfair, Jimmy?" Ford asked, now towering over the seated host. "What's unfair is being invited here under the pretense of promoting my work, only to be subjected to a character assassination disguised as entertainment." Kimmel looked up at the standing actor with something approaching panic in his eyes. "Harrison, please sit down. We can work this out." "No," Ford said firmly. "We can't. Because working this out would require you to understand that your guests are human beings, not props for your comedy routines, and I don't think you're capable of that level of insight." The brutality of the assessment left Kimmel speechless. The host, who had built his career on his quick wit and ability to handle any situation, found himself completely outmatched by an actor who had clearly had enough of Hollywood's games. Ford began walking toward the edge of the interview area, but then stopped and turned back to face Kimmel one final time. The movement was theatrical in the best sense, the gesture of a man who understood the power of dramatic timing. "You know what the real tragedy is here, Jimmy?" Ford asked, his voice carrying to every corner of the now silent studio. "You had the opportunity to have a genuine conversation with someone who's spent 50 years in this business, someone who's worked with the greatest directors of multiple generations, who's been part of some of the most beloved films ever made." Kimmel nodded eagerly, perhaps hoping that Ford was about to sit back down and salvage the interview. "Instead," Ford continued, "you chose to waste that opportunity trying to score cheap points with your audience. You chose spectacle over substance, sensation over sincerity." The words landed like hammer blows, each one driving home the magnitude of Kimmel's professional failure. The host's face crumpled as he realized that he had not only lost control of the interview, but had done so in the most public and humiliating way possible. "Harrison," Kimmel said one final time, his voice barely above a whisper. "I'm sorry." Ford paused, considering the apology. For a moment it seemed like he might relent, might offer some gracious response that would allow both men to exit the situation with some dignity and tact. Instead, he delivered the final devastating blow. "I believe you are sorry, Jimmy," Ford said, his voice carrying a sadness that was somehow more cutting than anger would have been. "I think you're sorry that this didn't go the way you planned. I think you're sorry that you're being held accountable for your behavior. But I don't think you're sorry for the behavior itself." With that, Harrison Ford turned and walked off the stage, leaving behind a stunned studio audience, a humiliated host, and what would undoubtedly become one of the most talked-about moments in television history. The cameras continued rolling as Ford disappeared through the backstage curtain, capturing Kimmel's shell-shocked expression as he sat alone at his desk. The host's mouth opened and closed several times as he struggled to find words that could possibly address what had just happened. Finally, he managed to croak out a barely audible instruction to his production team. "Go to commercial," Kimmel whispered, his voice completely defeated. But the damage was already done. In the span of 15 minutes, one of Hollywood's most private actors had delivered a masterclass in standing up to media bullying, while simultaneously exposing the ugly reality behind the polished facade of late-night entertainment. As the studio lights dimmed and the audience sat in stunned silence, one thing was crystal clear. Harrison Ford had just reminded everyone why some boundaries should never be crossed, and why respect isn't just a courtesy, it's a necessity. What did you think of Harrison Ford's decision to walk away? Was he justified in his reaction to Jimmy Kimmel's aggressive interviewing style, or should he have handled the situation differently? Let me know in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe for more incredible stories from the world of entertainment.